I swear to you, that coffin moved on its own, and the sound of those knocks still echoes in my mind.
Have you ever wondered what happens when the absolute silence of a wake is broken by something that should never be alive? This question has echoed in my mind since one night I witnessed something impossible to forget. As a gravedigger, I learned to deal with the weight of death every day, to endure the cold of early mornings between graves and the uncomfortable looks of people who avoid passing me outside the cemetery. However, none of this prepared me for that moment when I realized that death is not always silent, and that sometimes it manifests itself in ways no human being would like to witness. It was a typical wake, the kind where family members mourn in silence, exchange hushed words of comfort, and bid farewell to a loved one. When everyone had left, I was left alone in the hall, tasked with organizing the space for the next morning. The atmosphere seemed melancholy, yet predictable. Chairs still lined up, flowers already wilting in vases, dregs of cold coffee and plastic cups. I focused on my daily tasks, turning off lights and gathering up forgotten objects, believing nothing could interrupt the heavy silence that always accompanies the end of a farewell. It was at that moment, however, that something shattered this sense of normalcy. A muffled, unexpected sound suddenly appeared and froze my body. It wasn't creaking wood or wind rattling through poorly closed windows. It was coming from inside a closed coffin, and it wasn't a random sound. It was rhythmic, measured, as if someone were knocking with controlled force to be heard. At that moment, I realized that the real night had not yet begun, and that what I was about to experience would go far beyond any gravedigger's routine. If you also want to discover the depths of this disturbing story, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like to support this work. Each new story I bring here reveals even darker secrets than the last, and the next one could be the one that keeps you up at night. The hall, where everything took place, had a unique atmosphere, as if its walls carried the memory of all those who had passed through there for their final farewell. The lights were few, and those that remained lit emitted a faint, yellowish glow, reflecting off the polished surfaces of the coffins like small flames flickering in the darkness. The air was heavy, saturated with the sweet scent of wilting flowers, mixed with a faint odor of burnt wax from the candles that had been extinguished hours before. The silence was so profound that every noise seemed to take on a supernatural weight, and even the sound of my own footsteps echoed strangely, as if the space were larger than it actually was. The chairs were still arranged in symmetrical rows, as if silently awaiting the return of someone who would no longer come. The forgotten handkerchiefs on the seats and the plastic cups filled with cold coffee seemed like silent testaments to a recent mourning, mementos left behind by those who couldn't bear to prolong the pain. I walked slowly, gathering these objects, slowly turning off the lamps, closing the curtains that creaked as they slid along their ancient rails. The routine was mechanical, almost automatic, yet at the same time, every gesture seemed imbued with a strange sensation, as if someone were watching me from somewhere in the empty hall. Outside, the dawn stretched silently, with a chilly wind making the windows vibrate slightly, creating a sound reminiscent of distant moans. This environment, which had always been ordinary to me, began to take on a different dimension that night, as if every detail concealed something I couldn't yet perceive. With each step, the feeling of being swallowed by emptiness intensified, and the silence became increasingly suffocating. It was in this atmosphere of unbearable anticipation that an unexpected noise arose, completely changing the atmosphere and making it clear that something terrible was about to happen. As I gathered the last of my belongings and prepared to close the room, a muffled sound interrupted the absolute silence that reigned in the room. At first, I tried to rationalize, as we always do when faced with something that defies logic. I told myself it was just the wood creaking. After all, coffins are no different from antique furniture that creaks when the temperature drops at night. But the sound didn't have the irregularity of a wooden creak. It was constant, rhythmic, and charged with a clear intention, as if someone were communicating from within what was supposed to be their final resting place. I stopped where I was, my eyes fixed on the nearest coffin, and realized the knocking was coming from right there. At first soft, almost timid, as if testing my attention, then louder, with a rhythm that sounded like fists pounding against the lid. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine, but it wasn't just fear that paralyzed me. It was the logical impossibility of what I was. Hearing, because everyone knew the person resting there had died hours before, and there was no chance they could be alive. Still, the sound continued. 3 short knocks, a long pause, then 2 more firm knocks. It was a repeating pattern, so real and disturbing that I couldn't find the strength to ignore it. The silence between each sequence of knocks became more suffocating than the sound itself, as if the space between the blows were filled by an invisible presence that filled the room. My feet felt like lead, but a strange force urged me to take a few steps toward the coffin, even against my will. I needed to be sure, needed to confirm with my own eyes and ears that this wasn't a figment of my imagination. But the closer I got, the stronger the feeling became that I was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. And it was in that moment, standing before the lid of that closed coffin, that I realized I couldn't postpone the truth. I needed to confront whatever was behind that impossible sound. Each step that brought me closer to that coffin seemed to tear away a shred of my remaining courage. The echo of my boots against the cold floor was too loud, as if the room itself was warning me that I was going too far into something that shouldn't be investigated. With each knock that emerged from within the wood, my body reacted with an involuntary shiver, and the feeling that I wasn't alone became as concrete as the weight of the silence that fell between one sound and the next. I tried to breathe slowly, but my breath came in gasps, and my hands shook uncontrollably, betraying the terror that gripped me. When I finally stood before the coffin, the knocking stopped for a moment, as if the presence behind the wood had sensed I was there, still, attentive, vulnerable. The silence that followed was even more disturbing than the noise itself, because it created the expectation that something even worse was about to happen. I remained motionless, simply listening, and for a moment I almost believed I had imagined it all. But then, abruptly, the knocking returned, louder, more desperate, vibrating the lid as if someone were truly trapped inside and trying to escape at any cost. My instincts screamed at me to flee, to leave the hall and never return, but there was something more powerful holding me there, the need to understand. I moved even closer, touched the cold wood with my fingertips, and I could feel a real vibration, as if the energy of whatever was inside had transcended the barrier of the coffin and reached the world of the living. At that moment, I felt a wave of despair, for I understood that I was not merely facing an inexplicable phenomenon, but something that demanded to be heard, something that would not accept eternal rest. As I took a step back, trying to process what my eyes and ears were witnessing, a question took hold of my mind. If those knocks couldn't come from a dead body, then where were they really coming from? This doubt would haunt me until the end of the night, and it was this doubt that paved the way for the most sinister revelation yet to come. The next morning, still shaken by what had happened, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a deception of my weary mind, perhaps the result of loneliness or the suffocating routine of dealing with death daily. But any rational justification fell apart when I learned that, a few hours later, the body in that coffin had been taken directly to the crematorium. The cremation had gone smoothly, and there was nothing physical that could justify what I had heard. It was at that moment that the weight of the experience became unbearable, because while before I could cling to the idea that there might be a logical explanation, now all that remained was the terrible realization that the knocking did not belong to the world of the living. What disturbed me most was that same night, when the hall fell silent again, other funeral home employees swore they heard the same muffled sounds reverberating through the walls. Some said it was just an echo, others that perhaps the wind had caused some vibration in the empty coffins. But I knew, deep down, that no wind could reproduce that rhythm, that cadence that resembled a desperate cry for help. It was as if something had been trapped between two worlds, unable to move forward, and each beat was a desperate attempt to get the attention of those who still breathed. The feeling that the man's spirit refused to accept rest was inescapable, and I began to wonder if death truly represented the end. Perhaps there are situations in which the body turns to ash, but the consciousness continues to wander, imprisoned, trying in vain to communicate. With each memory of that night, the vibration of the wood still pulses in my fingertips, as if it had never left me. And although many try to dismiss what happened as superstition or exaggeration, I know the truth is otherwise, because no one who was in that hall can forget the sound of invisible fists striking a coffin lid already destined for the fire. That echo remains in my mind to this day, and it was just the beginning of a torment that I have never been able to erase. Because that night, the silence of death was broken, and something impossible was revealed before me. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those muffled knocks, echoing as if the funeral hall had preserved the memory of each blow. No matter how much time passes, the memory of that moment refuses to fade, as if it were etched not only in my mind, but in the very walls of that place. Often, walking through the empty hall on silent nights, I feel the same vibration in the air, as if an invisible presence lurks, waiting for the next opportunity to manifest itself. I've heard colleagues claim that nothing is wrong, that it's all just an impression or an echo of my imagination. But every time I try to believe it, the sound returns, steady, rhythmic, reminding me that some things cannot be explained by reason. I don't know if it was the spirit of someone refusing to leave, or if in that moment I witnessed a manifestation that doesn't belong in our world. I only know that logic doesn't apply when death insists on showing that it can still move. This episode taught me that there are limits we shouldn't cross, because by facing head-on what we don't understand, we run the risk of bringing something closer to us that isn't willing to leave us alone. And perhaps that's why, whenever I hear about absolute silence during a wake, I feel a chill run down my spine, because I've learned the hard way that silence can be nothing more than a fragile illusion. Behind it, there may be muffled voices, echoes of despair, and knocks that no one should hear, but which remain persistent, as a warning that death is never as silent as we'd like to believe. There are nights when the rain doesn't just fall to the ground, but seems to carry with it secrets that shouldn't be revealed. In the cemetery, where each drop echoes like a whisper from the graves, it's impossible not to feel the line between the worlds of the living and the dead growing thinner. You may never have considered it, but have you ever imagined being in such a place in the middle of the night and hearing insistent knocking coming from a coffin? Not an occasional creak of wood, not a noise that could be explained by wind or accumulating water, but rhythmic knocks, charged with a seemingly human intention. This is exactly the kind of experience I had, and it still makes me doubt whether some doors should truly be opened. That early morning I wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a co-worker, another gravedigger accustomed to the heavy grind of rainy nights. We both knew the silence of a cemetery and were accustomed to the constant sound of rain pounding on the stones. But nothing prepared us for what was about to happen. What we heard in that mortuary chapel haunted us for a long time. And I confess that even today, whenever the sky closes in and the clouds begin to roll in, I feel a shiver run down my spine, as if the past were returning to remind me of something I should never have witnessed. And it was precisely that night, under the weight of the storm, that we discovered that the dead do not always remain quiet in their coffins, and that sometimes the rain brings with it sounds that no man should hear. If you also want to discover the depths of this disturbing story, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like to support this work. Each new story I bring here reveals even darker secrets than the last, and the next one could be the one that keeps you up at night. The dawn was heavy, and the rain fell relentlessly, beating against the ancient tombstones as if trying to wring some forgotten secret from them. The cemetery, usually silent, seemed to breathe with the force of the storm. Water ran in rivulets down the stone corridors, forming small puddles that reflected the faint glow of our lanterns. The wind blew through the twisted trees, causing the branches to bend in unsettling movements, casting shadows that danced over the crosses and graves like ghostly figures. The cold was intense, biting, and each breath released white clouds into the air, reminding us constantly that we were in a land where the presence of the living was always temporary. I walked beside my co-worker, both of us in soaked raincoats, the water weighing down on our shoulders. Our steps were slow, not only because the mud made walking difficult, but also because the atmosphere seemed to force us to advance cautiously, as if we were crossing a place we shouldn't be. There was something different about that night, an uneasy silence that hid behind the sound of the rain, as if the cemetery itself were lurking. As we approached the small mortuary chapel, the unease grew. The ancient building loomed before us, its damp, weather-stained walls reflecting the light from the lanterns at odd angles, and the narrow windows let out only darkness. The wooden door creaked softly, swayed by the wind, and with each creak seemed to emit a muffled wail. It was as if the structure itself held dark memories of the ceremonies that had once taken place within. And it was precisely in this oppressive scenario, with the rain covering the world like a blanket and silence creeping in between the thunder, that the first unexpected sound reached us, so metallic and insistent that it froze our steps in the middle of the soaked corridor. It was at that moment that we heard something that couldn't be confused with the sound of rain or the blowing of wind against the cemetery's rusty railings. It was a metallic sound, steady, insistent, that seemed to come from inside the mortuary chapel. At first, we exchanged suspicious glances, trying to convince ourselves that perhaps it was just accumulated water running down somewhere in the ancient structure. But the rhythmic repetition of those knocks soon dispelled any doubt. It wasn't an irregular drip. It wasn't the iron expanding with humidity. It was a sound with a rhythm, as if someone were purposefully knocking, trying to be heard. With each new metallic crack, the feeling of unease grew. The echo reverberated in the sodden corridor, and our footsteps stuck to the clay floor, as if something invisible was trying to stop us from moving forward. My breathing became heavy, and I realized the same was happening to my colleague, who was now gripping the flashlight tightly, pointing it directly at the chapel door. The beam trembled slightly, betraying that his hands were unsteady. Instinct screamed to retreat, to leave it behind and pretend nothing had happened. But there was also an opposing force, a dark magnetism pushing us toward the unknown. The metallic sound continued. 3 consecutive knocks, then a short pause, followed by 2 more loud knocks, like a coded message we couldn't decipher. It was impossible not to imagine someone trapped inside, desperately punching for someone to answer the call. But the question that tormented us was simple and inescapable. How could someone be inside a coffin at that time of night? Even with this disturbing thought, we continued forward, and each step closer to the chapel seemed to increase the intensity of the knocking, as if whatever was inside knew we were coming. The sound became so loud that it seemed to penetrate not only the wooden walls, but also the barrier of reason, penetrating directly into our minds. And it was with this crushing psychological weight that we finally reached the chapel door, where a thick darkness awaited us, ready to reveal something we would never forget. We cautiously pushed open the chapel door, and the prolonged creaking of the wood sounded like an ancient lament, echoing along. With the thunder that rumbled in the distance, the interior was plunged into complete darkness, and only the feeble beam of our flashlights moved between the coffins lined up on iron supports, reflecting brief glints off the varnished surfaces of the lids. The air inside was humid, permeated by the smell of wet earth mixed with the scent of ancient wood, and each breath seemed heavier than the last, as if we were inhaling the very weight of the room. It was in this oppressive silence, interrupted only by the sound of rain pounding on the roof, that we realized the impossible. One of the coffins, positioned right in the center of the room, was visibly vibrating, shaking as if it were being struck from within. The wood creaked in protest with each blow, and the sound echoed so intensely that it seemed to be beyond the confines of that space, as if it were invading our own minds. My colleague and I exchanged a quick glance, and I could see in his eyes the same terror that paralyzed my body, the same internal struggle between running immediately outside or staying to face whatever was happening. Each blow on the lid sounded more desperate, as if someone or something was trying to escape that prison. The coffin shook frantically, and for a moment I felt as if the wood would split before our eyes. My heart hammered so hard in my chest that I felt my legs threatening to give way, but there was a strange pull that held us there, as if some invisible force compelled us to witness until the end. I held the flashlight steady, shining it directly on the vibrating lid, and noticed fresh scratch marks appearing on the surface, as if invisible nails were continuing to dig inside. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a physical manifestation before us, and in that instant I understood there was no turning back, because the next step was inevitable, opening that lid and facing the truth hidden within. With trembling hands and our hearts beating wildly, we slowly approached the coffin, which still vibrated as if it were alive. With each step, the pounding grew louder, and it seemed as if the chapel walls absorbed the noise, sending it back in a dark echo that surrounded us on all sides. My colleague's breathing was rapid, and I could clearly hear his teeth grinding, as if trying to contain the fear that was nearly making him recoil. I myself was torn between the urge to run away and the morbid need to discover what was happening before my eyes. We held the lid together, and for a moment we hesitated, as if time had stopped just to give us the chance to give up. But curiosity and terror mingled into an irresistible force that pushed us forward. With a heavy creak, we slowly lifted the lid, hoping to see something that would justify our desperate blows. But what we found was far more disturbing than any moving body could have been. The interior was empty. There was no body, no shroud, nothing but a layer of damp earth spread unevenly, as if hastily dumped. But what chilled our blood were the deep marks of fingernails scratching the wood inside. Every groove, every notch, every splintered piece of wood seemed to tell the story of someone who had fought with all their might to escape, but was no longer there. That emptiness was worse than any moving body, because the body could be explained, but the complete absence of human remains, accompanied by clear signs of despair, left a gap that no amount of reasoning could fill. I looked at my colleague and noticed in his gaze the same question that echoed in my mind. Who or what had been in there, and where had it gone? The silence that followed was absolute, as if even the rain had stopped for a moment, simply to make room for the weight of that revelation. And it was in this suffocating emptiness, in front of a disembodied coffin with marks of struggle, that we understood that the worst was yet to come. Because certain presences do not simply disappear. They continue to prowl, invisible, waiting for the next opportunity to manifest themselves. After that night, every time the rain begins to fall and the wind blows through the cemetery trees, I feel the knocking echo again in my mind, reminding me that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The mortuary chapel, already a heavy place by nature, has become even more unsettling because every time I walk through its door, I feel the air thicken, almost as if charged with an invisible presence. The other staff have begun to avoid solitary patrols on rainy nights, and even those who have never believed in supernatural stories admit there's something strange about the place. The images of that empty coffin, the damp earth scattered about, and the desperately dug-in nail marks remain vivid in my memory as if they happened yesterday. No logical explanation can erase the feeling that we witnessed a vestige of something beyond the limits of human understanding. Perhaps it was a trapped spirit, perhaps an echo of ancient suffering, or perhaps something even darker, preferring to hide in the darkness, only to manifest itself when the storm offers the perfect cover. I learned that early morning that it's not always the body that haunts the living, but the emptiness it leaves behind. And this emptiness, when accompanied by clear signs of struggle, is more terrifying than any moving corpse. Because what isn't there may very well still be among us, invisible, silent, yet attentive to every step we take. And to this day, when I hear the metallic sound of rain against the cemetery gates, I feel my heart race, as if it were only a matter of time before those beats return, demanding that someone, once again, have the courage to open the lid of a coffin that should be in eternal silence. Since I began working among graves, I've learned that every cemetery holds secrets not recorded in any official records, stories passed from mouth to mouth like veiled warnings. One of the oldest and most frequently repeated has always sent shivers down my spine because it involves a fear I myself have felt on some lonely early mornings, the dread of being buried alive. Many may consider it exaggeration or superstition, but if you've ever walked alone among crosses in the darkness, you know that certain fears don't need logic to become reality. It was through listening to the older gravediggers that I learned the story of the so-called bellman, a former employee who worked at this very place decades before I was born. They said he was tormented by the thought of waking up in a closed coffin with the earth weighing down his chest and his throat choked with screams that would never be heard. For him, this was true hell, not death, but the knowledge of being trapped in the dark, with no chance of salvation. And perhaps that's why he made an unusual request, which at first seemed merely eccentric, but which would become one of the darkest legends I've ever heard. Upon his death, he demanded to be buried with a rope tied to his finger, connected to a small bell placed on the surface of his grave. If he awakened, he would only have to move his hand, and the metallic sound would echo through the cemetery, summoning whoever was on guard. At the time, everyone respected his wish. Some even laughed, but no one dared deny it. What no one could have imagined is that many years later, this bell would ring again, not by the hands of a man, but as an echo from the depths, reminding us that the dead do not always remain silent. If you also want to discover the depths of this disturbing story, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like to support this work. Each new story I bring here reveals even darker secrets than the last, and the next one could be the one that keeps you up at night. I remember the first time I heard someone tell this story in detail. It was a cold night, and the older members sitting near the tool shed reminisced about incidents that had never reached the cemetery administration. Among so many stories, one stood out and everyone spoke of it with the same tone of respect and fear, as if even the air around it needed to be measured to avoid awakening something that still lurked nearby. They spoke of the old employee, a man who dedicated his entire life to caring for the dead, but who harbored a phobia greater than any of us could bear. He feared, above all, being buried alive. It was said that this fear was so strong that it consumed his mind in the final years of his life. Each time a funeral was held, he would approach the coffin and observe it in silence, as if putting himself in the deceased's shoes, imagining the agony of waking in absolute darkness, his body paralyzed by panic and his lungs consuming the last of his air. Back then, newspaper reports still circulated of people waking up at wakes mistaken for corpses. It was not uncommon for doctors to misdiagnose their bodies, and this only fueled the man's terror even further. So, before he died, he left a specific and unusual request. He wanted his body buried with a rope tied to his finger, connected to a small bell positioned above ground. This way, if he woke up, he could move his hand and call for help. Some colleagues laughed at the idea, saying they would never hear anything in the wind or rain, but no one dared disobey his wishes. And so it was done. The bell remained above ground, silent, until decades later, when his coffin was exhumed, something was found that would transform the legend into an even more real nightmare. It would be many years before the bellman's name was mentioned so frequently again. I wasn't present at the exhumation, but the story had been told so many times by elders that it's impossible not to remember every detail when I close my eyes. That day began as a routine task, opening old tombs to reorganize cemetery spaces, a common occurrence in cities needing to make room for new burials. No one expected to find anything other than the usual sightings of these procedures: bones, the remains of shrouds, and wood already weakened by time. But what was revealed inside that coffin left everyone silent, as if the air itself had become too heavy to breathe. When the lid was lifted, there was not the expected repose of a motionless body. What was seen was a scene of despair etched into the wood. The body, or what remained of it, lay in a contorted position, as if it had turned inside the narrow space. The arms were raised, and the fingers curled toward the lid, betraying a struggle waged until the last moment. The rope that should have kept the bell within reach was broken, falling across the chest, as if it had been pulled so many times that it gave up. Most disturbing, however, were the marks scattered throughout the coffin's interior. Deep scratches, loose splinters, scars in the wood that even today make any gravedigger avoid talking about this episode for a long time. There was no longer any doubt among those who witnessed the scene. The old clerk had awakened, just as he had always feared, and his last hope, the bell, had failed. Perhaps no one heard the ringing that night, or perhaps the sound was lost in the wind and silence. What everyone knew was that the coffin bore proof of real agony. And it was after that day that the strangest stories began, because it wasn't long before bells were heard again in the cemetery, even when none of them were tied to a grave anymore. After the exhumation, the cemetery was never the same. I was still young when the first reports began circulating among the staff, but I clearly remember how the tone of voice changed whenever someone mentioned bells during the cold early mornings. These weren't stories told lightly, like someone telling a legend to pass the time, but whispered confessions as if speaking aloud could invite what no one wanted to witness again. Many swore that on icy nights they could hear the metallic tinkle of a bell echoing among the graves, a distant, muffled sound that didn't match any object in the cemetery. I myself, once, during a solitary patrol, stopped suddenly upon hearing what seemed to be a metallic vibration spreading across the dew-soaked ground. At first I thought it was my imagination, perhaps the product of stories I already knew, but the sound continued, irregular, as if carried by the wind. It was a short, insistent tinkling that came and went, as if begging to be noticed. And the closer I got to the source of the noise, the further it seemed to recede, leading me between the aisles of tombstones like an invisible guide. Other colleagues reported similar experiences. Some said they heard not only the bell, but also muffled rings, like faint knocks against wood. These descriptions were always accompanied by the same disturbing detail. The sounds seemed to come from underground, echoing from within the graves. There were nights when 2 or 3 gravediggers claimed to have heard it together, making it impossible to dismiss it as individual delusions. Gradually, the legend ceased to be just about the old employee and transformed into something larger, a presence that seemed to haunt the entire cemetery, as if fear of him had permeated every inch of earth. And wood, I knew the most striking story was still missing, the one that would definitively confirm that it wasn't just imagination. That's when the oldest gravedigger decided to share what he'd heard, an experience that still gives me goosebumps just remembering it. It was on a particularly cold morning that I first heard the direct account of the cemetery's oldest gravedigger. He was already nearing retirement, but his face bore the marks of someone who had seen too much to recount in detail. That night, he sat beside me with a grave expression and, without looking directly at me, began speaking in a low voice, as if afraid something or someone might overhear. He said that once, during a solitary round, he heard the bell ring. It wasn't a distant memory or a rumor passed down by word of mouth. It was a personal confession, charged with a sincerity that made it impossible to doubt. According to him, the sound began softly, almost imperceptibly, blending with the breeze through the trees. At first, he thought it was a branch scraping against iron, or perhaps the swing of some forgotten chain. But then the tinkling sound repeated, clearer, closer, as if someone were pulling hard on the rope. It was at that moment that fear took hold, because there was no longer any doubt. The sound was coming from underground. He stood still, trying to understand if it was real or just the result of exhaustion. But what came next destroyed any possibility of a logical explanation. After the metallic ringing, he heard muffled, loud knocks against the wood of a coffin. The old man described how his legs trembled and how the lantern in his hand wavered wildly, illuminating the crosses and tombs around him, all still, all silent except for the sound that seemed to be crying out for help. He didn't dare check its exact source, knowing that every step toward the sound could mean facing something he would never forget. He ran back to the warehouse and never again made a solitary round on bitterly cold nights. As he told me, I noticed his eyes welling up not with emotion, but with a deep fear, still fresh after so many years. For him, there was no doubt that the spirit of the bellman still wandered the cemetery, trapped in an eternal cycle of despair. And this confession, so raw and so real, made me understand that the legend was not just a memory of the past, but a constant presence, one that could manifest itself at any moment. To this day, when I walk through the cemetery on cold nights, I feel that the silence is never complete. There's always a pause between the wind and the sound of rain, a gap where there seems to be room for something else, something that shouldn't be there. In these gaps of silence, I've caught myself believing I hear a distant tinkling, a metallic sound so soft it could be mistaken for my own imagination. But the truth is, after so many stories and so many testimonies, I can no longer say with certainty where legend ends and reality begins. The image of that exhumed coffin, with its broken rope and the marks of despair etched into the wood, is enough to make me understand that the bellman's fear was not unfounded. He foresaw his own fate, fought against it, and still could not escape. What remains now is the feeling that his presence continues to wander among the graves, not as a body, but as an echo, a call that was never answered. Perhaps that's why so many of us gravediggers still hear the bells in the early hours. I often think that death, in some cases, doesn't end a person's story, but cruelly prolongs it, leaving scars not on the body, but on the space they once inhabited. And when I'm alone, looking at the fog creeping over the cemetery grass, I remember the words of the oldest gravedigger. It's not the silence that should frighten us, but what can pierce it. Today, I believe he was right, because if you pay close enough attention during a freezing dawn, you might also hear a distant bell calling for help. And in that moment, you'll realize that some stories don't stay buried. Ever since I began working in funeral homes, I've always known that the silence of the dead can be more frightening than any screams of the living. The embalming room, for those who've never been inside one, is a space where time seems to cease. The strong smell of chemicals permeates the breath. White lights illuminate every corner as if to eliminate shadows. But paradoxically, it is precisely there that darkness is most present. And it was in this place, where everything should be predictable and controlled, that I experienced one of the most disturbing experiences of my life, something that haunts me to this day on the nights I close my eyes and remember that dawn. Imagine standing before a closed coffin, a simple wooden container that holds a body prepared for its final resting place. Now imagine that without warning, this coffin begins to move on its own. At first, a slight, almost imperceptible vibration, as if the weight of death were not enough to keep it still. Within seconds, what seemed merely an impression became an undeniable reality. Dry, rhythmic knocks, so loud they cracked part of the lid. It wasn't wood creaking, it wasn't the natural contraction of a body. It was something coming from within, as if the deceased were trying to escape. I was there, alongside other employees, and we all heard the same thing. The initial reaction was disbelief, but fear quickly set in. The room, already heavy by nature, seemed to close in on us, the question echoing in. Our minds was the same. Should we open the coffin? And it was precisely the moment we approached that the situation took an even darker turn, because what seemed to be alive inside suddenly fell silent, plunging everything into absolute silence. If you also want to discover the depths of this disturbing story, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like to support this work. Each new story I bring here reveals even darker secrets than the last, and the next one could be the one that keeps you up at night. The embalming room has always had a weight, unlike any other part of the cemetery. When I enter, I feel as if the air is denser, charged not only with the strong smell of formaldehyde and other chemicals, but also with an invisible presence that lingers over everything. The smooth white walls feel cold to the touch, and the metal instruments, perfectly aligned on steel trays, gleam under the artificial light of the fluorescent lamps. Everything is clean, controlled, and technical. But none of these details can hide the fact that there is no room for life there, only for the preparation of the inevitable. The silence that dominates the room is almost absolute, interrupted only by the low hum of the ventilation, and occasionally the creak of the metal cart as it is dragged across the smooth floor. I was accustomed to the routine, and each body that arrived was treated with the same respect, as if the last gesture we could offer was to preserve the dignity of the departed. However, that night, as I helped position the coffin that would later become the protagonist of what I witnessed, I realized something was not right. Perhaps it was the feeling that the room seemed colder than usual, or perhaps it was the way the light flickered at almost imperceptible intervals, creating shadows that moved across the walls as if they had a life of their own. My colleagues also noticed the strange atmosphere, but no one commented. It was as if there was a silent agreement that speaking out loud about this discomfort could give form to what we were all feeling. The coffin was placed on the iron stand, and for a few minutes everything seemed normal again. But it was only the calm before the storm, because what was to come next would be unlike anything we had ever witnessed inside that room. It was as we were finishing some adjustments that I noticed the first sound coming from the coffin. At first, it sounded like a quiet creak of the wood, something anyone might associate with the weight of a body settling in or a change in the room's temperature. But what froze me in place was the repetition of the sound, now drier and more rhythmic, as if someone were pounding inside. The heavy silence of the room amplified each impact, and within seconds we were all staring at the closed lid, unable to take a single step. The creaking turned into insistent knocking, so loud that the coffin began to visibly vibrate on its metal support, and the sound echoed off the walls as if amplified, reaching every corner of the room. My colleagues looked at each other in shock, and I could see in their eyes the same mixture of fear and disbelief that gripped me. It was impossible not to feel that what we were witnessing defied any logical explanation. The knocking grew in intensity, increasingly violent, until an even more disturbing sound echoed. The wood of the lid began to crack. Small cracks appeared, as if the internal pressure were enough to rupture the coffin from the inside out. The sound was terrifying, not only for the physical impact, but for what it suggested. It was as if something trapped inside wanted to escape, and the possibility paralyzed our bodies and minds. Someone murmured whether we should open the door, but the voice was so shaky, it sounded more like a whisper lost in the air. No one moved. We were caught between professional duty and the most primitive instinct for survival. The sound of the knocking continued, dry, aggressive, rhythmic, like a desperate heart, until, in an instant I will never forget, everything changed. When we finally took a hesitant step toward the coffin, the knocking suddenly stopped, plunging the room into a suffocating silence that seemed even more terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. The sudden absence of sound was as violent as the knocks that preceded it. We stood still, each of us holding our breath, hearing only the distant echo of the ventilation's hum and our own hearts hammering in our chests. It was as if the room had been emptied of all life, plunged into a dense, almost solid silence that enveloped us like a suffocating layer. I took a hesitant step toward the coffin, and each squeak of my shoe soles against the tile floor felt like a scream in the absolute silence. I didn't want to get closer, but I felt I had to, as if something invisible was pushing me forward, testing my courage. My colleagues fell behind, and I could tell none of them dared even take a deep breath. The tension was so palpable, it felt like an invisible wall separated us from the coffin. I reached out, hesitating just inches from the lid, and in that instant, I felt a shiver run down my spine, a chill so intense it felt like it had penetrated my bones. The silence, instead of calming, became increasingly oppressive, as if it concealed something greater, something just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I looked to the others for some sign of encouragement, but all I found were wide eyes, fixed on the same spot as mine. It was as if we were trapped in a frozen scene, where each second stretched into an eternity. The coffin, which had previously vibrated almost violently, now remained still, quiet, as if it had never moved. This stillness, however, brought no relief. Rather, it was a kind of calm that suggested menace, like the pause before a storm. I pulled my hand away, unable to touch the wood, and in that gesture, I understood. There was no need to open it to confirm. Something inside was alive in its absence, as if the darkness itself had taken over. We stared at each other again in silence, without saying a word. But we all knew that the night wasn't over yet. and that the answer to what we'd witnessed would come in a much more disturbing form. It wasn't until a few hours later, as dawn was giving way to the first signs of dawn, that the truth about the deceased emerged. I was exhausted, but I still couldn't bring myself to leave the embalming room. I felt as if leaving that space was a way of denying what we had witnessed, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't end simply with the silence that enveloped us. One of the senior employees arrived carrying a folder of documents, and leafing through them before us, revealed details that completely changed the weight of the situation. The man inside that coffin was no ordinary man, not just another body consigned to the funeral home's mechanical process. He was a man accused of murder, a man who, according to records, had terrorized his own family and died before even facing trial. The words echoed in the room like a verdict no one expected to hear. A shiver ran through me as I associated those violent blows with the possibility of a spirit filled with rebellion, incapable of accepting its final rest. The sudden silence we witnessed no longer seemed coincidental, but rather a calculated gesture, as if the dead man himself had been aware of our approach and had decided to seize his blows to maintain the mystery. The more I read about his life, the more evident it became that this was no coincidence, but an echo of all the violence that man had unleashed in life. Some colleagues tried to rationalize, saying that perhaps the movements were the result of accumulated gases or delayed physical reactions. But even they spoke with fragile conviction, not truly believing what they were saying. I, on the other hand, felt I had witnessed something beyond any scientific explanation. The coffin didn't just move, it screamed silently, trying to show us that some souls don't rest, don't accept the darkness, and continue to fight even when everything should have ended. And it was in that moment that I understood that the embalming room would never be the same again, for the true weight lay not in the bodies we received, but in the spirits that refused to depart. Since that night, the embalming room has never felt like just a workspace. Every time I enter, I feel the air carry something invisible, as if it were still saturated with the pounding we heard that early morning. The silence, which was once just a natural detail of the environment, has now become a deafening sound, because I constantly wonder what might be hidden behind it. It's as if the walls hold a living memory, and every time the light flickers or a crack echoes, my entire body reacts, anticipating a repeat of something that should never have happened. The man who lay in that coffin was remembered not for his life, but for what he caused even after death. Accused of heinous crimes, he seemed to carry a weight that did not dissolve with his last breath. Perhaps his anger had transformed into energy that still churns, unable to find peace. Perhaps the knocking was proof that the end had not been enough to silence him. Or perhaps it was simply a warning, a cruel reminder that some spirits refuse to remain trapped even after burial. It's impossible not to think about this every time I walk down the hallway of the funeral home. My steps slow, my ears become more alert, and every tiny noise becomes a warning sign. I try to convince myself it was just an isolated incident, but deep down I know that some stories don't end. They just wait for the moment to repeat itself. And when that happens, perhaps I'll be there to witness it again. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for future stories. Here, each story reveals a new secret about what happens when death doesn't mean silence.